In Japan, a clandestine base converted into a deadly training camp for a wartime mission of no return.
The weapons created here would be turned against American sailors. Hundreds would lose their lives.
An Italian town whose people were given lethal advice by government officials.
They told the locals to stay inside. This is what signed, tragically, their own death warrant.
And a floating fortress in New Jersey that became a sanctuary and a savior.
This marvel of engineering played its part in some of America's biggest battles.
In southern Japan are the remains of a facility that defined a desperate moment in the nation's history.
We're in Ozu Island, a really thin strip of land just a few miles long. This seems like a normal little harbor.
But along the cliff face, there is a tunnel entrance. When you come out the other side, there is only the pier and then the open sea. There's not a lot to tell us what this place is for.
And it makes you wonder, how is this tunnel connected to the other structures we see around here?
This site was devised to inflict mortal wounds on Japan's rivals. But as their empire crumbled, it was given a horrifying new mission.
Their own culture would lead the Japanese armed forces into a different way of engaging with their enemies.
These people are indoctrinated to sacrifice their lives for their country.
This was the last shred of their homeland that these men would ever see.
There were things you couldn't say, things you would see or hear. It made you realize that we were at war.
Kenichi Tanaka was born on Ozu Island. He remembers when his peaceful home became a hive of mysterious activity.
The Navy had their eyes on it. It was the perfect place to test their top secret weapons.
The Japanese had good reason to keep this site concealed. In the late 1930s, when it was first operational, Japan was hell-bent on expanding its empire.
By this point, Japan, having defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, sees itself as kind of the overlord of East Asia. They want the United States out of Asia. And as tension ramps up, Japan needs a much sharper naval weapon to counter what they see as inevitable American pressure on them in the Pacific.
So the Japanese Navy starts to design what becomes the Type 93 torpedo. The Type 93 has got a top secret tank of oxygen inside that is going to make it ever so slightly faster, ever so slightly more powerful than any other torpedo around.
The Navy now needed somewhere away from prying eyes to trial run their deadly new technology. In 1937, construction began on Ozu Island.
They test them here because of the size of the Seto Sea and the fact that it is remote and there's not going to be any collateral damage.
After a year of development, the Japanese Navy perfected their secret weapon with the data they gathered here. It was now the most advanced naval torpedo in the world.
The effective range of the Type 93 torpedo is 13 miles. And the best American torpedoes in this period, their effective range is 8 miles. So this gives the Japanese an immediate edge.
Although the American military had no idea this new weapon even existed, they would soon find out. In December 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor.
And the Type 93 torpedo would prove devastating against the Allies in the Second World War.
During the Battle of the Java Sea alone, the devastating weapon destroyed multiple Allied ships. But by mid-1942, it became clear Japan had seriously underestimated the strength of the American military.
Over the next year, the U.S. Navy, Marine Corps start to conduct the island hopping campaign. As island after island is taken away from the Japanese Empire, the Americans are getting closer and closer to Japan itself.
So they start casting around for new ideas. How does this outgunned, outnumbered, out-industrialized power go toe-to-toe with the United States? They have to find new, diabolical weapons.
This site is going to be developed into something terrifying, something desperate.
The Japanese Navy would be inspired by a bloody confrontation 1,500 miles south of Ozu Island.
At the Battle of Saipan in 1944, the Japanese garrison launches a suicide charge at the American invaders, and 4,000 Japanese soldiers just run at the American lines, and almost all of them are killed. This banzai charge at Saipan, heralds a new kind of Japanese warfare.
The Japanese Naval Air Service starts to use the so-called kamikaze aircraft attack. And the Japanese Navy is going to find its own way to conduct suicide attack.
In September 1944, this facility was given a menacing new purpose: to turn men into human torpedo pilots. These horrifying new weapons were called Kaiten.
They take these Type 93 torpedoes and they say, why don't we, put like a suicide pilot on each of these torpedoes? We'll make a little cabin with 30 minutes of oxygen inside, and the guy will steer it into the side of an American destroyer.
When adding the cabin, the Navy also increased the length of the torpedo to allow for 3 times more explosives than the original Type 93.
A Kaiten was big enough not just to sink a destroyer. The Kaiten had enough payload to sink a battleship, to sink an aircraft carrier.
Incredibly, when the Japanese Navy advertised for people to pilot these suicide submarines, and they were seeking 200 such people, more than 2,000 17 to 28-year-olds applied.
By November 1944, just 2 months after training began, the first Kaiten pilots were ready to attack. Before they left this base, their sacrifice was honored by the island's residents.
We went to see them off once with our teacher. I saluted them. As a child, I think I admired them. I thought they were courageous.
On November 6th, 8 Kaiten and their pilots were loaded onto submarines. 2 weeks later, they had U.S. ships in their sights.
There's a huge explosion. The fireball is so big that it looks as though a lot of ships have gone up, including an American aircraft carrier.
In late 1944, the Japanese developed a deadly new weapon of war at this base, the Kaiten, a human-piloted suicide torpedo. At dawn on November 20th, they launched their first attack against the U.S. Navy.
5 Kaiten are deployed from 2 Japanese submarines against the USS Mississinewa, which is a fuel supply ship. There's a huge explosion, and 63 U.S. sailors are killed in the attack.
The fireball was so big that the Japanese assumed that all these Kaiten had hit targets and they'd blown up this entire assembled fleet in this anchorage, but in fact they sank 1 ship.
But because the Japanese believed the mission had been more successful than it really was, it gave them a sense of false confidence.
So they poured more resources into the program thinking that this would be a secret weapon.
They were wrong.
And for the rest of the war, they only sank like a couple of ships. It promised incredible results, but delivered very little. Far more Japanese sailors died than Americans were killed by this program.
Regardless of the Kaiten success rate, the Japanese even made plans to deploy them against an American invasion of the mainland.
But it never came to that, as Japan finally surrendered after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This terrifying and inhumane weapon of war was consigned to a dark period of Japanese history.
Every year since 1962, the relatives of Kaiten pilots and the people of Ozu Island have gathered to remember the young men who left here never to return.
Those suicide crew who died in the war for their country, we must give our respects. And for that reason, the souls of those 106 people are enshrined here.
In central Italy stand the ghostly remains of a catastrophe that left a trail of broken dreams in its wake.
This is a beautiful part of the world. The landscape is rugged, the mountains are snow-capped.
Nestled in the middle is what looks like a town typical of this region. Yet the cobblestone streets are eerily quiet, and it creates this very unsettling feeling.
These buildings look as if they've been caught in a moment of time. People left this place in a hurry. Why?
The only reason you would do that is because you're running for your life.
All hell broke loose. You just couldn't move. You could only hold on for dear life.
The warning signs were all around, yet the authorities chose to ignore them.
They told the locals to stay inside.
That turned out to be a terrible and tragic mistake.
Nessuno ha detto uscite. No one said leave, quite the opposite. They'll carry their sins in their conscience.
This disaster devastated the entire region and claimed hundreds of lives.
But the question that haunts everyone is, could this tragedy have been avoided?
Coming back here makes me feel sad. What hits me the most is the silence. You could hear radios or TVs, children playing, riding their bikes.
Giovanna Cologrande grew up in this sleepy rural town. It was a tight-knit community, forged through family and friendship.
Mimo and Clementina lived here. I would pass by their house, and often Mimo was playing the piano, and I would sit outside to listen.
The earliest history of this town dates back to about the 12th century, so it really has stood here for hundreds of years.
There were generations that had grown up here, living side by side with each other.
This is the town of Fossa. High on the hill is the most important building for those that lived here.
It's called the Chiesa di Santa Maria Assunta, and it was built in the 18th century. Every Sunday, it would be packed to the rafters.
On Sundays, we used to dress with more care. We were going to church to praise the Lord. We would wear our best. You couldn't show up in a tracksuit. We would look good, elegant. I came here every Sunday, but now I rarely go.
A storm was coming that would test the faith of the town's residents.
On December the 14th, 2008, this region was struck by a series of tremors called a seismic swarm.
Just over a month later, in January 2009, the tremors began to intensify in both severity and frequency.
At the beginning, we kind of underestimated them. They were low intensity. We didn't pay too much mind. It was the growing frequency that started to worry everyone. A lot of people developed panic attacks.
There was good reason to be concerned. After all, Italy is the most geologically active area in all of Europe.
If the big one came, the town's residents wanted to be ready.
But predicting earthquakes is not considered scientifically possible. Yet Gianpaolo Giuliani, a local amateur seismologist, claimed he knew how to do it. He installed radon detectors in the basements of buildings in the nearby city of L'Aquila and elsewhere in the region. Giuliani believed that the release of this gas signaled a looming tremor.
When the seismic swarm occurred, he noticed increased radon levels in his detectors and predicted that a major quake would strike in a town 30 miles from here.
On March 30th, 2009, the earthquake did happen, but it was much smaller than Giuliani anticipated.
As a result, the authorities put an injunction on Giuliani for causing unnecessary panic and alarm.
He was even forced to take down his warnings from the internet.
But the day after, there was an earthquake, 4.2 on the Richter scale. The residents in the region were now terrified, especially because they had been told that there was no basis to Giuliani's claims.
The Italian government convened a special committee of 6 scientists and a government official, Bernardo de Bernardinis, to assess the risks.
So after the meeting, the government official relayed the scientists' discussions to the public.
We were told that the frequent earthquakes was just the release of energy, but that wasn't true.
In April 2009, the residents of Fossa and the nearby city of L'Aquila were advised by officials that a series of low-level earthquakes were not a cause for concern.
About a week later, in the middle of the night, a 6.3 magnitude tremor struck the Abruzzo region, and this was the deadliest the country had seen in 30 years.
Fossa was directly in the firing line.
People were sleeping when the quake hit, and the ground began to shake violently.
We could not get out of bed. It was terrifying. Like being in the hands of a dragon.
Cracks opened up in buildings. Huge boulders sheared off the sides of mountains and came crashing down on the town.
My house is quite modern and was built accordingly. But my relatives and my husband's relatives lived here in the old town. So we drove as far in as we could. And we found hell.
In one building, a boulder has struck a house, and bunk beds that children once slept in are left exposed.
It was sheer chance they weren't sleeping there that night. They would have been killed. But 4 people did die. A 3-year-old girl, a 76-year-old lady, and a couple who died together. They say they were hugging each other.
In the nearby city of L'Aquila, the situation was even worse.
Entire buildings were reduced to rubble, and 70,000 people were forced to flee.
309 people were killed, and more than 1,600 were injured.
The dust didn't even have time to settle before the backlash began.
Mounting anger led to the region's capital of L'Aquila bringing a prosecution case against the scientists who said there was no reason for alarm.
The prosecution didn't blame them for not predicting the earthquake, but rather for the failure of accurate communication.
The fact that they told people to stay in their homes was a key part of the trial.
If you say to people, don't worry, they won't worry. One of the scientists said, have a glass of Montepulciano and go to bed.
A year later, the 7 defendants were convicted and sentenced to 6 years imprisonment.
The result triggered an international outcry, as researchers around the world felt science itself was being put on trial.
Many in the scientific community warned that it would discourage scientists from sharing their expertise for fear that they might face lawsuits in the aftermath.
5,000 scientists signed an open letter demanding that these defendants be released. And in 2014, the Court of Appeal overturned these convictions, but the families of those that lost their lives were outraged at this.
I'm a believer, so if our justice failed, there'll be divine justice. Let's hope their dreams are tormented. Sorry if I'm blunt.
Now, well over a decade later, reconstruction is happening in Fossa, but it's a slow process.
After the event, people have changed. A lot of them would like to come back, but many are still afraid. We need to carry on and try and rebuild this place and repopulate it.
In Camden, New Jersey, lie remains of an American juggernaut that symbolizes an era plagued by global conflict.
We are on the Delaware River, and on it you can see this huge mass of metal just glinting in the sunlight.
You don't have to be a naval expert to realize that you are looking at a battleship, and a big one at that.
So the ship had served in World War II in Korea and earned 13 battle stars and the affectionate nickname, the Big J.
It was an avenging angel to American servicemen in conflict time and time again.
In Vietnam, this vessel achieved something extraordinary.
We fired all 9 16-inch guns, and then we had the plane come back and tell us, congratulations, you're the first battleship to sink an island.
But any ship with a service record that long is bound to eventually run aground of controversy. And that's what happened with this one's last deployment to the Middle East.
In New Jersey, floating on the Delaware River, is an icon of American strength. In 1968, Steve Sheehan began serving aboard this vessel. At the time, he was an electrician's mate.
Taking the first steps on board since I've been discharged made me feel like I was finally home.
This now peaceful ship was built at a time when the United States was on the brink of war.
The American government sees the writing on the wall, and in July 1939, 2 months before the German invasion of Poland, they commission an entirely new class of battleships. When this vessel was launched, it was the biggest and most powerful battleship in the entire U.S. Navy.
This is the USS New Jersey, one of 4 Iowa-class battleships built to strike fear into the heart of America's rivals during World War II.
Able to hold a crew up to 2,700, the New Jersey was a floating fortress.
It had 9 16-inch guns and a secondary armament of 20 millimeter and 40 millimeter anti-aircraft batteries to protect the battleship from aerial attack.
In 1944, the vessel arrived in the Pacific, ready for war. It served with distinction, playing a key role in the Battle for Leyte, the largest sea campaign of all time. But despite its critical role in the American victory, its days were numbered.
By 1957, the USS New Jersey had reached the end of its useful life. The era of big battleships was really coming to a close.
Naval technology is changing, and the battleship is being supplanted by the aircraft carrier, because the aircraft carrier can engage targets at much longer range. When the Vietnam War begins, the Americans begin this air campaign called Rolling Thunder, where they send planes over North Vietnam to take out critical infrastructure.
But these repeated sorties are ending up putting American pilots in immense jeopardy.
Around 1,000 U.S. aircraft were shot out of the skies, with the same number of pilots being wounded, killed, or captured.
As increasing numbers of downed U.S. airmen were paraded on TV screens around the world, pressure mounted to find a new way to attack the enemy.
The U.S. Navy had a secret weapon, and it was one that would save American lives.
On August 1st, 1967, the USS New Jersey gets the call.
I thought, this is my opportunity to go on board a ship. And when I came up here and looked at the battleship, and I went, my God, that thing is big. Then we went to the Panama Canal, and then we were off to Vietnam.
On September 29, 1968, the USS New Jersey arrives off the Vietnamese coast, and the next day it opens fire.
The New Jersey would maraud up and down the coast, demolishing bunker complexes, fortified positions, troop concentrations, and sinking enemy ships in the process. The ship would also provide ad hoc artillery support to U.S. troops on the ground near the coast.
In one 3-day battle, it's estimated that the New Jersey saved 100 American lives for each day it was deployed there.
It sounded like a railroad train as a projectile went through the air. It just boom, 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 boom before it hit. So they knew that battleship was coming to their aid.
With this unrivaled firepower, the USS New Jersey is able to pull off the unthinkable in the South China Sea.
The ship was called on to bombard some coastal artillery on an island.
The captain said, all hands, get your battle stations. It's going to be a 9-gun salvo.
When the USS New Jersey fired up, it ended up sinking part of this island.
This is reported with great enthusiasm back in the States, with newspaper headlines saying that the New Jersey has sunk an island.
But to the troops fighting on the ground, Big J, as it became known, was much more than a battleship. It was a sanctuary, providing a safe place for exhausted soldiers to rest and relax away from combat.
The poor guys hadn't had showers in weeks. They got a good night's sleep, a warm bed, hot dinner, good breakfast. When going by where they were bunked, we had to walk softly because we knew they were still asleep and we wanted them to be asleep.
For the beleaguered troops, an even bigger surprise lay in store. At 10 a.m. on Christmas morning 1968, a helicopter touched down on the deck of the USS New Jersey.
So this is approximately where I stood when Bob Hope was on the top of the turret with all of his gorgeous women. And the deck was filled with Marines, Army, and Navy. When those girls came out, the place went wild.
Bob Hope was a lifelong performer and comedian. He first began entertaining troops in 1943 during World War II.
It was always something that the troops yearned for. It was a break from the monotony.
He stayed around afterwards and thanked everybody for their service. He was very generous. He was a wonderful guy.
But less than 4 months later, Big J was called back to the United States. Among the ship's crew, it was rumored the North Vietnamese refused to engage in peace talks while the battleship patrolled their coast. 4 years after the Jersey returned home, America's involvement in the Vietnam War finally ended when they withdrew from Saigon.
Sadly, the next time the New Jersey was called into action, it ended with tragedy.
By the early 1980s, the battleship USS New Jersey had been defending America for 40 years, and its service was not over yet.
In 1983, Lebanon was in the midst of a messy and brutal civil war.
The New Jersey was dispatched as part of a peacekeeping force. Its massive guns were soon called on to retaliate when U.S. naval reconnaissance planes were fired on by enemy combatants.
But there was a problem. The ship's powder had been mixed incorrectly, so these huge guns were wildly inaccurate and they were missing their targets by big margins. Civilians were likely killed as a result of that, and so America's reputation in the region took a hit.
These were the last shells ever fired in combat aboard the USS New Jersey. After leaving Lebanon in 1984, Big J continued to serve in the Pacific and the Persian Gulf until 1991, when it was officially retired. It was a ship of such significance, it was even featured in Tom Clancy's classic Cold War thriller, The Hunt for Red October. In 2001, the USS New Jersey was turned into a museum. Steve Sheehan now shares with the public the story of America's most decorated battleship.
They should know about the people that have fought for their freedom and the ships they were aboard.
On England's south coast is an aging complex designed to defend the nation's borders.
Overlooking the port, a vast structure is etched into the hillside. It seems to dominate the town and the coastline.
It's a real jumble of architecture from different eras.
There are cannonades, defensive ditches. This is clearly some sort of military stronghold.
Once intended to keep Britain's enemies out, it turned into a site that trapped people within.
There's barbed wire and shiny metal fences, a sports pitch, and a foreboding castle-like structure. There's no mistaking this place is a prison. So what kind of criminals were kept here?
Yet looks can be deceiving, and not all is as it seems. Despite its appearance, this building was not planned to be a prison.
But the people who pass through here tell a very different story.
Weekly, you were hearing someone trying to commit suicide because they've lost all the hope.
For centuries, the coastal town of Dover has been the gateway to Britain. Its proximity to mainland Europe, only 21 miles from France, across the narrowest part of the English Channel, often made it a target that needed to be defended.
Let's just say the British and French have had their disagreements over the years.
In 1803, the rise of a new dictator named Napoleon Bonaparte spurred a frenzy of construction. He posed the biggest threat to the island nation in over a century.
During the Napoleonic Wars, the fort held barracks for 200 men and was intended to house 12 24-pounder guns in large casemates.
It was called the Dover Citadel, and it formed part of the biggest defense network ever built on England's south coast. If Napoleon dared to cross the Channel, Britain was going to be ready. Defensive ditches, ramparts, and barracks were built in anticipation.
But the feared invasion never came, and when the war ended, it was put on hold.
But over the next 150 years, the Dover Citadel continued to be upgraded to combat Britain's foreign adversaries.
The fort would remain garrisoned through both world wars until 1944, when the threat of Nazi invasion had passed.
For the next 50 years, parts of this site were converted for use as a prison for young offenders. In the year 2002, it would be transformed once more.
This impregnable structure went from defending against enemy forces to a new kind of front line for Britain.
On England's south coast is the ruin of a Napoleonic-era fortress. It was transformed after a wave of instability swept across the world in the 1990s.
Global conflicts in places like the Balkans, Somalia, Sri Lanka, and the Middle East triggered large-scale population movements.
The UK government was struggling to deal with the growing numbers of refugees.
In the late 1970s, individual asylum applications to the UK were around 300 a year. In 1999, there were more than 70,000.
They resorted to housing some asylum seekers in criminal prisons.
But that was only a short-term solution. This is the Dover Immigration Removal Center, the British government's answer to a growing refugee crisis.
The nationalities of those detained tallies closely with countries that have been torn apart by war in recent years. Iraq, Syria, for example.
The facility housed over 300 asylum seekers.
Your freedoms are very restricted. At night, the doors to your cell are locked, and you're held there until the following morning.
Jack Smith is visiting for the first time since he was detained here in 2015.
I'm from Afghanistan. When I first been brought here and been put in this building, I was very, very afraid and suffered a lot, going through depression, anxiety.
Jack's path to this place began in the aftermath of the September 11th attack on the World Trade Center. Following the US-led invasion of Afghanistan, Jack's father served in the newly formed Afghan army, fighting against the Taliban alongside American soldiers. But in 2006, the Taliban launched a major offensive, marking the most significant escalation of the war since the regime was overthrown. Jack's father was killed during this violent period. As the Taliban regained territory, the country became more dangerous for those opposed to their radical beliefs.
Imagine what it must have been like. It must have been absolute hell for them. Tens of thousands were forced to flee.
Jack was one of them. In 2007, he arrived in the UK illegally and applied for asylum.
First day when I come into this country, I'm being taken to the police station, and then they have asked me what was the reason that I've come to this country, which I told them, and then transferred me to foster care. I was 14 years old.
Jack spent the next 8 years in a legal limbo, waiting for his asylum application to be processed. But in 2015, when Jack was 22 years old, he was detained in this building after failing to report regularly enough to the authorities.
There was a bunk bed here, and my cellmate was on the top. It was very, very noisy place, because imagine how many rooms, and every single room they were putting 2 or 3 people.
At any time, you could be presented with the news that you were going to be deported within the next 2 weeks back to the country you'd suffered so much to escape.
Jack discovered he faced the same fate after being held here for around 2 months. The country he fled in 2007 had become even more dangerous following the emergence of the Islamic State terrorist organization.
My head went spinning. I was like, gosh, this is very short time. But then I was trying to find a lawyer to do something and to cancel the removal decision.
For some, the fear of being sent back to the country that they'd escaped from was so bad, they decided to take their own lives.
So a lot of people were going through a very hard time. They were thinking it's better to die here, so they were just hurting themselves.
But Jack didn't lose hope and fought the decision to return him to Afghanistan. He managed to find a lawyer who helped secure his release and get him permission to stay in the UK.
It was the very happiest moment the day when I've been released, because I wasn't expecting that would ever happen to me. Now I have the ability to make my life better day by day and make new friends. I feel very, very lucky.
Around 6 months after Jack was freed, the Dover Immigration Removal Center was decommissioned.
In 2015, it was announced the detention center would be shut down, with the government citing its lack of modernity, security, and proximity to airports.
In 2022, Jack was granted refugee status and could now start his new life in the United Kingdom. He has high hopes for what the future holds.
This country has saved my life and has given me dignity. Now it's time for me to do something and pay back and be able to help those people like me who has very difficult past